After that night, after the white cloth covering the mirror somehow disappeared, I felt something had changed. The mirror no longer reflected reality as usual. Sometimes, when I passed a room, I saw a reflection that didn't match, like a room with an open door, even though I had clearly locked it. And the most chilling thing, I once saw my own reflection, standing upside down in the mirror, my feet up, my head down, my body still, staring at me expressionlessly. Every time I stared at the mirror for too long, my head felt heavy, as if something was pulling my mind into it. The pain stabbed to the bone. I tried to ignore it, but my nights became more restless. I decided to cover the mirror again, this time more tightly, with a thicker black cloth. I even embedded small nails in each corner so that it wouldn't come off. I thought that would stop everything. But that night, when I was almost asleep, a sound was heard, loud and shrill, like a cloth being torn with force. I woke up with my heart pounding. The room felt quiet, too quiet. I tried to ignore it, turned over, and tried to sleep again. The next morning, the cloth was gone. There was no trace of cloth or nails on the floor, as if it had never been there. And what made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end? The mirror reflected me, sleeping. But the position of his body was different from reality. I slept on my side, but in the mirror, I was lying on my back, with my eyes open. Since then, I started experiencing sleep paralysis. My nights were filled with fear. I woke up but couldn't move. My eyes were open, and I could only stare at the mirror standing in the corner of the room. And there he was, the figure. Pocong. His body jumped slowly, approaching through the reflection. His movements were strange, stiff, and unnatural, like a puppet moved by invisible strings. Her face was pale, her eyes were empty, and on her lips there was a small, twisted smile. I could only stare. My breath was short, and when the ghost arrived in front of the mirror, she did not enter the room. No, she just turned her head, slowly, and looked directly at me, through the mirror, with a gaze that seemed to say, "Don't stare too long." That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. After last night's events, when the Pocong stared at me from inside the mirror with its head turning slowly, and a small smile that refused to be forgotten, I knew this wasn't something I could ignore. Cold sweat soaked my back, even when the night air felt biting. The mirror was still standing in the corner of the room, still unmoving, but I knew it was alive. The next morning, I decided to find out. I had had enough of being silent. I had had enough of being scared in the dark without knowing what was happening to me. I started from the most logical place, the campus archives. As a transfer student, I didn't know much about the history of this place, but this old boarding house clearly had a past, and I felt I was just a visitor in a story that was darker than I had ever imagined. I opened old documents, reports of campus events from years ago. Most of them were boring. Lists of activities, assignments, the usual news, until I found a crumpled piece of paper with a campus letterhead dated 20 years ago. Student dies due to suicide. His name was written faintly because the ink had faded. Rafi Maulana. He was found hanging himself in his boarding room. The address was exactly the same as the room I was occupying now. My heart was beating fast. I didn't go back to the boarding house right away. There was one thing I wanted to ask, to people who had lived around here longer. That afternoon, I walked down a small alley behind the boarding house. Several houses looked old, with weathered wooden windows and mossy roof tiles. I stopped in front of the house of an old woman I often saw sweeping the yard in the morning. Her name was Mrs. Rukiah. After a little small talk, I immediately asked, "Ma'am, in the past, was there a student who died in that boarding house?" She froze. Suddenly, the look in her eyes changed. He didn't answer directly, just stared at me for a long time, before finally speaking softly. "His name is Rafi, a good boy, quiet. But they said he stole his roommate's money. That's a lie, right?" "I don't know. But everyone believes he did it, even though it hasn't been proven." He paused for a moment, then looked at me with teary eyes. "Rafi couldn't stand it. He hanged himself. But that's not the saddest thing." I swallowed. Because his family was ashamed. His body wasn't wrapped properly. The cloth was tied haphazardly. There was no prayer, no forgiveness. And the mirror. That was the mirror he always stared at before he finally left. When I returned to the room, the sky was already dark. Inside the room, the mirror seemed to welcome me, waiting for me. I stood in front of it, staring at the reflection that had been bothering me all this time. I approached, closer, and for the first time, I tried to ask directly, "Rafi, if you're still there, I want to know." No answer. But when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I felt something unusual. The reflection didn't move. I tilted my head, but the reflection remained still. My hands started to tremble. "Are you not me?" The reflection smiled. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was filled with questions. Who exactly was in the mirror? Was the me outside still me? Or, since when, did I become a guest in someone else's body? I went back to my college notes that night, searching for more. And I found something that made my blood run cold. The mirror wasn't just an antique. It was a summoning mirror. In ancient Javanese belief, a mirror that was used continuously by someone who died tragically could store the traces of their soul. If the soul wasn't accepted, not bathed, not prayed for, it could stay. And if someone took its place, the soul could slowly absorb you. I looked at the mirror once more. Slowly I approached and whispered, "You're angry because they silenced your story." The mirror began to fog up. Not because of dew, but like there was a cold breath from inside the glass. Then suddenly, the reflection changed. I saw Rafi, standing in the same position as me, but with a white cloth wrapped around his body. The shroud was not a random ghost. It was him. Rafi, the one who was not properly shrouded, the one who was not given time to defend himself, the one who was forced to remain silent, even in his death. The next day, I went to his grave, located in a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The tombstone was simple. Some of the letters had been eroded by time. I sat in front of the grave and read a prayer. For the first time, perhaps since he was buried, someone said his name with respect. Forgive them. Forgive me. The afternoon wind blew softly, as if whispering something. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again. But now, I wasn't afraid. I stared at the reflection, which was no longer still. It nodded slowly. Then, it disappeared. But before it disappeared completely, it left one thing behind. A smile. Not a creepy smile, but a calm one. As if to say, finally, someone is listening. I stared at my reflection again, and this time, it was really me. But before I went to sleep, my reflection in the mirror blinked, while I didn't. The days after the discovery of the mirror's origins felt different. I began to feel that something had changed inside myself. It was no longer about the scary mirror or the strange reflection, but about myself that felt strange. That morning, I woke up later than usual. When I opened my phone, there were dozens of messages from my friends. Where were you last night? Why didn't you answer even though you passed in front of my room? You were scary last night. Like you weren't you. I frowned. I was sure that I didn't leave my room last night. I remember I just sat down writing notes about the story of a student who committed suicide, then went to bed at 11. But the messages didn't lie. There was also a photo from the boarding house's CCTV sent by the night guard. It was clear. I was walking in the hallway at 2 in the morning, staring straight ahead, expressionless. I couldn't remember that. The following days were filled with strange moments. I sat in my room, looking at old photos in my phone gallery. In some selfies, my face looks different, paler. My smile is unnatural. My eyes feel empty. When I met my old friend Randy, my friend's reaction was more surprising. Randy just stared at me for a long time, then said softly, "What's wrong with you? It feels like you're not you." I laughed to lighten the mood, but the laugh sounded strange to my own ears. One night, when I was brushing my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror, I saw something. Out of the corner of my eye, the reflection of the old mirror in my room seemed to move. I walked slowly towards the room. The lights were off, only lit by the moonlight. The mirror, although dark, reflected my reflection. But the reflection stood a little straighter. Its eyes opened wider and smiled. I didn't smile. The next night, a cracking sound was heard from the mirror. Small cracks just appeared, as if the glass was holding back pressure from within. I tried to cover the mirror again with a black cloth, but the next day, the cloth fell and tore. The mirror opened again, as if refusing to close. I was losing control. I woke up in different clothes than when I went to sleep. Sometimes I heard my own voice talking, even though I wasn't talking. I started avoiding mirrors, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Then that night came, the last night. It was 3 in the morning. The cracking sound grew louder. I woke up and stared at the mirror. The cracks in the glass spread like a spider's web, slowly, as if something was trying to get out from behind the glass surface. And then, something protruded. A hand, wrapped in a white cloth like a shroud, penetrated the glass. Then the head of the Pocong appeared, but with my own face. The Pocong jumped down from the mirror. Its movements were stiff, jerky, like a broken doll. I stepped back, panicked, reaching for the door. But my body didn't move. I was frozen. My own reflection approached and touched my face. When I woke up the next morning, the world felt different. I stared at the mirror. The reflection in the mirror looked normal. But when I raised my hand, my reflection didn't follow me. The reflection stayed still, then slowly raised its own hand in a different motion. I stepped back. The reflection smiled. Then slowly, the face in the mirror faded to black and disappeared. I touched my face. Everything felt real, but I felt like I was no longer human. The next few days, the room was empty. The boarding house residents just thought I had moved out secretly. The room was locked. Then a few weeks later, the boarding house owner rented it to a new resident, a new student from out of town. The boy entered the room, feeling a little uncomfortable with the damp atmosphere and musty smell. Then he looked at the old mirror at the end of the room. He stood in front of the mirror, combing his hair, looking at his own face. Then he realized something strange. His reflection was slightly delayed, and there were two reflections in the mirror, even though he was alone. One of them was smiling. Sometimes what takes over is not the desire to live, but the desire to be remembered. You think the story ends here, but are you sure the shadow is only in the story? Press like if you are still brave. Subscribe. Because of the next story may be closer than you think. Comment what story you want to hear next, because the night eyes will always see you in the dark. And don't forget, look carefully to your mirror tonight.